There are principles at place you need to be aware of. You need to bend the rules. You can't break it, even if you're a small brand. And if you bend the rules correctly and you apply the principles, you make a shitload of money.
Welcome to Brands of Value, the podcast about evergreen ideas in marketing and strategy. I am David Göz, and today I'm joined by Peter Kiefer, managing partner at PUNCH Marketing Consultancy. With a background as head of strategy at leading agencies, he specializes in brand positioning and marketing strategy, always with a focus on real and sustainable growth. In this episode, we will explore what small brands can learn from his experience. How do they position themselves effectively? How can they grow without massive budgets? Let's dive in. Hi, Peter. Welcome to Brands of Value.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
Now, this show is called Brands of Value, and I ask every guest the same question. What does value mean to you?
Well, value for me basically is a misleading word. Many people confuse value with price. And if you talk about a value brand, people automatically jump to the conclusion it's cheap. For me, value, and especially in the context of brands, it's what does consumer get out of it? And that can be a high value and a low value. So, for instance, high quality or low quality, or a high emotional benefit and much joy, or the contrary, no joy at all. That's value for me in the context of brands.
Well, that sounds like you have a very good grasp of what value is and what value isn't. But today we're going to talk about what value we can bring maybe to small brands and how small brands grow, because you're an absolute expert in that. I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say. So why does the approach that big brands use not work for small brands?
Well, first, I think you need to acknowledge that the big brands approach, like, for instance, if you read How Brands Grow, those principles apply to small brands as well. You can't outsmart the market or get rid of all the principles, etc. But the main thing is you don't have the budget for it. You don't have the physical availability for it. And so you need to build it up. And so you need to act within those principles, but you need to bend it a little bit to make it really work for you as a small brand with smaller budgets or other capabilities you have than the big brands. So I think that's basic outset I always start with. So you can't ignore the principles. You need to be aware of all those principles, but you need to bend it to your situation.
So a good analogy to this is that if you look at an influencer and look at what they're doing right now, it's not what got them there, but the principles of their best practice of their best posts still apply to your posts, but maybe you don't have the capabilities, the same editing suite, the same camera to afford to even get to the same level of content. But what are those principles that I just used an analogy for brands? What are big brands using to grow their brands?
There are a few, at least from my point of view, which are on the utmost importance. The first one is access share of voice. We can go into that during the discussion.
Yes, please.
Basically, maybe for all the listeners who aren't aware of access share of voice, what it means is for every roughly 10 points, you spend more in advertising than your competition compared to your market share, you will grow your market share. And that's a pure numbers game. So if you appear big in communication and you are everywhere with your communication, you will grow your market share more or less automatically. And obviously, this kind of principle can't be applied to a small brand. If you're a small brand, yes, you don't have to spend that much money to be bigger than your market share, but still you need to have the money. And that's one of the main problems. The second one is basically go after everyone in your category. So if you listen to everything Byron is saying, or if you're reading the red book, How Brands Grow, they will tell you the more important group of your acquisition target are the light buyers because they're the bigger group. And if you convert from 80%, let's say, just a few, you will get more money out of it in total than when you just look after the 2% heavy users, for instance. So that's one thing. And that's true. And it always comes back to the money thing. I'm really afraid to say that because it's something like a not very encouraging thought that it comes always back to money. Because if you want to go after everyone in the category, you need to have the money to do that. But there are ways to do that, and we can go into that. These are the main two principles, for instance. The second or the third one is, and it has to do with the light buyers and the heavy buyers. It's about segmentation. The big brands, if you have a look at segmentation, basically it's an overrated concept because if you want to go after everyone, why split the market? That's certainly something you need to think a little bit differently when you're a small brand. But the main challenge with segmentations is that there aren't that many differences between different consumer groups. My personal nemesis is basically segmenting by age. So this whole generational approach of many brands is basically just plain stupid. You can get rid of all those generational, this Gen X is different than the millennials and so on. It's superficial, it's plain stupid, and it will get you in a direction which isn't really working. But there are ways to segment the market, for instance, by different needs. And if you know the needs, then you can cater to those needs. Big brands can cater to everyone and can cater to different segments. Smaller brands can't, but you can still pinpoint a specific segment where you can work best, where you have the best position, for instance, where they live, for instance, is something which is quite interesting because then you can choose the right shops where your products are available. But that's one part of the whole equation. Those are, for me, the main principles. I know there are many, many, many others, like, for instance, the ratio between brand advertising and performance marketing. And that's certainly something which is important. But I'm not that of a firm believer of this is exactly the right split to do it. I know Les Binet and Peter Field are talking about a 60-40 rule. And in theory, I think that's awesome because I'm a believer in doing both. And I know it's working because I know it's working when I see it from different companies I'm working with. But getting this ratio is almost impossible. I've never seen it ever in action. That's just a harsh truth, but that's the way it is.
Awesome, Peter. So in summary, you said one of the principles big brands use is having excess share of mind by excess share of voice and by excess share of availability. You talked about heavy and light buyers. For anybody who doesn't know what that is, please refer to the episode with Ethan Decker, where we went into great depth about that. And you talked about how segmenting the market is really necessary for smaller brands, but that segmenting by age and by all of these age groups and these made up segments like Gen Z, Gen Alpha, Gen X is pretty stupid. And that there are some other principles, such as the ratio between brand advertising and sales focused advertising, as featured by Les Binet and Peter Field, that maybe aren't quite so strictly applicable in their ratio, but they're still relevant. So that's some of the principles big companies use. And those things, they're still relevant to small brands, you say, but they're not really applicable because you need a lot of money to make them work. Talking about money, many companies then go and say, well, if I can't reach all of the people, I'm still going to try to reach as many people as possible. But why is reach such a bad KPI? You wrote a whole article on that. Could you go into detail?
Yeah, I think I need to work on the article because I think reach is one of the most important and crucial KPI there is. Problem with reach for smaller brands is, especially if you combine it with all the other logics like light buyers, reach for all in the category, etc., small brands don't have the money to do that. And you can still optimize for reach, but then you need to make the market smaller. So what I mean with that is we worked with a beauty brand. I can name them. It's Essence and Catrice. They're huge in Germany. They're basically the market leader in terms of volume. And we work with the regional teams to make the to come up with the strategies in the different markets. And obviously, they have markets where they are established and they have markets where they are quite new to the market. And we worked, for instance, with them in Italy and in the Italian beauty market. As you can imagine, a German brand is not that high on the shopping list of Italian consumers. And you could go now two ways. You could go the way like, okay, let's look for those few people who are already open for a German beauty brand and try to convert them. Or you can go after reach and try to convert many people, even though they're maybe a little bit further away from buying a German brand. And as Italy is quite huge, you need to think about, do I have the money to reach them all? The answer is no, you can't. And what we did is basically say, okay, let's focus on a few regions. It's a regional approach. So you go basically for, let's say, Northern Italy. And within Northern Italy, you can go for reach. And you can go for all of those people in the smaller market, the northern part of Italy. And then it works. What it does is basically it allows you to achieve much more easy access share of voice. So it comes back to that. Reach is quite important because if I have to choose between reaching two people once or one person twice, I will always advocate for the two people once. Because yes, the effect is not that high as if you would talk to them twice, but you still have an effect and you have it doubled because you now doubled the chance that you have an impact with one of two people. And it's the same thing if you apply it to millions, etc. And so for me, it's not about frequency in terms of advertising frequency. It's always reach, and frequency comes with it basically automatically.
I think that's quite true. You now talked about the way that you can still use reach as a metric, but restricting it by market. I think the thing that you wrote about in the article was also looking at the quality of the reach that you generate, because it's not only about reaching as many people as possible, but also making sure that the reach actually has an effect, so that you're first aligned with the effectiveness of your messaging and with the effectiveness of actually achieving your goal before you then optimize for reach. Is that still correct for small brands as well?
Totally. And I think it's much more important for smaller brands than for bigger brands. Let's say you have, and I think that's where the industry made a big mistake when they splitted media and creative. Because now you have a media agency incentivized by basically efficiency, and they will go after reach if you tell them. And what's the easiest way to do that? Go into cheap media. If I just want to have reach or impressions in this case, I go probably all digital. I will probably go for tiny banner advertising, etc. And I don't say they do that, but in the extreme, I would go into that direction. However, then I appear as a small pixel on a screen instead of having the chance to make a real impact. So you need to balance this kind of, yes, reach is important, but you can't trade it with effectiveness. So it still needs to make an impact. And therefore, it's important to look at kind of attention metrics or you go just after econometric modelings and just have a look what kind has the biggest impact in terms of effectiveness. So, and it's quite easy to think about that. If I'm sitting in a cinema and I'm forced to look at a big screen and I can't go out, then I will automatically have a bigger impact than when I'm just seeing an advertisement in my social feed for a fraction of a second. And I think that's quite easy to comprehend, but we forget about that when we are talking just about reach. We need to talk about both reach, efficiency, and basically effectiveness.
Quite funny that you mentioned that, because just today I saw a media suggestion by a media agency that went after a target audience of about 127 million impressions per month on a total budget for 6-7 months of 77,000 euros at the CPC of 0.25. And basically what that means is that out of the 127 million impressions a month, only 0.00001% or something maybe click at an ad, and they then maybe convert. Which is just what you said. It's easy to get lots of reach because you can show it to potential of 127 million people a month, but the effect of it is very, very, very little. You might as well throw money somewhere and look whether somebody picks it up.
True. On that note, I'm sometimes joking with clients and say, why do we look at clicks? Basically, the clue is already in the name, even with the digital advertising. It's called display. So I want to show you something. And I don't really care about the tiny number of people clicking on an advertisement. And it's just plain stupid, because I think we need to think about more, do I make an impression in the mind of the consumer, instead of, do they actually do something like clicking on it? I don't really care if they click, because maybe they just see it, and if I then maybe they Google me afterwards and buy 2 hours later, a day later. But that's something which is hidden in all the dashboards and in all the numbers, and the obsession with, like, okay, what's the click rate, etc. The click rate is tiny.
Attribution and all of these metrics.
Exactly. I mean, they're useful. I'm not saying it's a total waste of time, but we forget about the more important stuff because it's just not in the dashboard.
Talking about the more important stuff, should a small brand now go out and buy cinema ads just because you said that's the most effective way to optimize their reach?
I'm not quite sure if I'm saying that cinema ads are the most effective way. It's just the best example, because everyone can get into that thinking. I know it sounds like a lawyer answer. It really depends. If I can, or if I have the budget to go after what we used to call above the line media or mass media, I would totally go for it. Not just because it's just much more easy to get loads of reach at once, and you probably will have a bigger effect in terms of this one placement will make a bigger impression in the mind of the consumers. But also we know that we are not as rational as we like to think as consumers. And there's a reason why it works if you say as seen on TV, because then I can trust you more. And why is that? Because basically, if I go for, let's say, out of home or for TV advertising or cinema, people know that's expensive. They have this shortcut. If you are trusting in your product so much that you spend loads of money on it, it must be good. And it's a classical example of the medium is the message as well. So because of this kind of easy heuristic of our shortcut in our mind to say, okay, they believe in their product because they advertise it for it in a very costly way. They have the confidence it's a good product, so maybe I try it. It's not just about what I'm saying, it's also the medium here as well in play.
So that's the idea of costly signaling that
exactly.
Rory Sutherland quite likes to put into the world as well.
Exactly, and I really like that, and I'm not just liking it. I know it's working. We work with a small startup. Actually, it's not that small anymore. They sell hearing aids. And they used to go through the classical startup marketing phase. Performance first and performance marketing and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that, because in the beginning, you need to make money. Otherwise, you need to close your company. So yes, it's totally the right way to do. But at a certain point, you need to switch a little bit more into the play of brand advertising or broad reach advertising, whatever you like to call it. I'm not a big fan of this kind of, these are the fixed terms for everything. Whatever you like to call it, you need to go out of this kind of making money now and try to go after a more longer midterm approach to advertising. So you have the chance to influence future buyers as well.
So you travel up the funnel.
Yes, yes.
What does that mean for startups? So they start off with obviously optimizing for sales just to keep their company afloat and to also obviously please their early investors, because when people invest money into a startup, they want to see that the product actually sells, and then obviously you optimize for that. But at what point would you say that starting to build brand would make sense? And are there maybe hidden effects to building brand that can help you with finding new investors, finding better suppliers, all of those things?
There's no doubt that if you are a well-known brand, you will have a much more convenient conversation with investors because they know you, they don't need to explain what you're doing and so on. So I think that's one important thing. But staying on the consumer side of it, what we did a modeling once for basically a mid-market brand. And what we had a look at was, do they actually sell more when they are on price promotion, when they had a TV advertisement at the same time? And the effect was huge. So the price promotion effectiveness went up by double digits. And that was kind of interesting. What is much more interesting is when we had a look at what kind of message was sent in this TV advertisement. It had nothing to do with the price promotion. It was just a brand spot, basically. Even the product within this TV ad wasn't the same as the price promotion product. So the uplift is still there, even if you're not promoting the concrete offer you're using in your price promotion. But just because people are more aware of your brand, they are more open to buy in your price promotion as well. And you can transfer that to all the other mechanics you have. So if you're running all this kind of search advertising, for example, if you build your brand, if you go up the funnel, people are much more likely to search for you directly or go to your website directly, and you don't need to pay for every visit in your shop, for example. And that's for me the real power of, in short term, of brand communication. On top of all these kind of long-term effects that people come to you automatically all over again, and you know them, etc. pp. So, and you don't have to pay them with price promotions basically to use your product.
Mhm.
And I think that's something which is kind of overlooked when we work with startups. Basically, we see a pattern coming through. Normally, in the beginning, they all start with performance marketing, which is fine. We already talked about that. Then they try to experiment with like still performance thinking, but in broader reach media. So for instance, if you have a look at Snox, what they're doing, they basically take their performance thinking of buy now socks, buy now underwear, to TV. And that's basically the second stage all these startups go through. After a while, when you optimize for this, then they start to invest in proper brand building, like image brand building, if you like. And there's a mind shift there, because then you need to go away from the product, more into the emotional side. You don't talk about this awesome feature anymore, but more about how does it make people feel to use it, for instance, or create a mission, whatever is the right thing for this specific brand then.
Two questions about that. So the first one is, what's the typical timeline about that? I think most startups get that wrong in terms of their thinking. They both think too short term. They think, oh, I need a brand right away. And they don't start going into brand quickly enough once they've reached a certain point. And the second question is, isn't brand also maybe costly signaling? Like, isn't the investment of a company into a brand a form of signaling, hey, I've spent all of this time building reputation, now I can't be bad anymore, in a sense? I'm so well known, I can't afford to fuck up.
So let's start with your first question. Yes, there are two groups. The ones which are more like, we need to build a brand now and from the start, which is kind of dangerous, because then you rely on this kind of non-specific, non-product specific messaging to convert people to buy something. It can work, but I think there's the safer route to go for performance-based marketing, which is more focused on the product, the benefits, etc., to get money in first. Typically, I would say after 3 years, we start to see people moving into this kind of second stage where they take this performance approach to broader mass media, if you like. One thing I would always recommend is to build your brand assets early on. So in terms of distinctiveness, like how do people know that this brand is talking to me? The logo, the colors, the font, maybe the models, if that's applicable, or if you can do that. This should be quite early consistent because it helps you over the long run. So because then you don't start from scratch every time. But I wouldn't go for brand advertising in the start. I think the opportunity costs are too high to do that. After 2 to 3 years, you can start experimenting with the broader reach media. And if you are comfortable with that, and maybe that can be after just 6 months, maybe it takes a little bit longer, then you can try to go after this kind of classical brand building, image building, like we all know from Nike, for example. And the reason for that is if you are a startup, you are experimenting so much with your product market fit, and you're still you're basically in your teenage years. You're still trying to figure out who the hell are you. And startups know that in terms of investment pitches, like, okay, we want to change the world, blah, blah, blah. But that's not something which is working for the consumers because consumers don't care. And so they need this time to figure out who are we. And if we ask someone, how many are we? So to say, it's really like a finding process for yourself as well. And that's something which is quite important, especially in this day and age of AI. I've seen so many voices saying, we don't need any strategy anymore because we can do it with just a little prompt and we get the results. Or we don't need a project defining our brand because we can do that easily with AI.
I just wanted to talk about that with you as well, because I have a feeling that many startups, especially at the start, want to save money, and then they go and say, we need a logo, let's go on Canva. Let's click on the logo creator and have a logo created. And I recently went to a startup event, and the event decided that for event purposes, they would put all of the logos in black and white on nice light boxes backlit. So basically just a cutout. And I looked through this hall, and literally all of the brands looked the same. They had this minimalistic style with maybe some shape next to it, and it looked very mediocre. And I think that's the point you were trying to get to as well. Using AI tends to mediocrity, and the point you were making earlier as well, trying to be distinct from the start and investing into some assets that really make you stand out in the sea of bland. That's where you're getting to, right?
Partly. I think that's the obvious problem because they look all the same. And you could argue it doesn't really matter that much because if all those startups at this event are not in the same industry, who cares? I would still go for a distinct logo, by the way. But there's also value in going through the process and through a painful process. I think it's even if you don't do anything with it, it's still better to go through the process because then you are much clearer about many, many, many things. And in terms of brand, you basically know who you are. In terms of strategy, you know what you don't want to do. Mm-hmm. And even if you don't follow the strategy, you still thought it through. And I think that's one of the things we often overlook, that there's value in the process as well.
In which process? You mean in the process of building brand?
In defining brand, in building brand, in defining a strategy, in executing the strategy. Obviously, you can't look into the future and say, this will work, definitely. But you need to experiment and you need to go through all these processes, and you can't shortcut it because then you basically take away the experience that you could make from going through the process, from doing the execution, from getting feedback. You don't have that. And if you end up with a solution which isn't working, you need to start from scratch and you don't know why it's not working.
So that's your argument against using AI in
Exactly.
that early process.
Exactly.
Right, yeah. And that's quite aligned with the whole process of building great startups anyways, because the main thing that stops a larger company from just copying your idea is the whole validation stage of it, right? You need to validate your idea in the same way you need to validate what you stand for and what brand you try to create. And within that validation lies a lot of the value created with a startup.
Yes, I totally agree. It's especially when it comes to brand, we who are doing it sometimes forget that the consumers or the customers, whatever you call it in your industry, they don't care about all these brands, all these advertising, or whatever. They have better things to do. And we know everything from heart, and we know it because we spend hours and hours and hours within the company, with the brand, in workshops, in PowerPoint presentations, etc. And we know the tiny differences between A and B and your competitor and so on. Consumers are more superficial than we like them to be. And that's not that they're stupid, but they just don't have the time to invest in looking at something and try to decipher what's the hidden message in there. And so you need to be quite aware of that fact that people need to get it from a glance. If you can, that's for example a good example of value in the process. If you end up basically a workshop for defining your brand by trying to come up with an advertising line, it doesn't have to be perfect. Just try to say, okay, if this is my positioning, what's the advertising line, and put it on a billboard poster. And if you can't do that with just one line, you know you're not specific enough. And people won't read the long text in your presentation. They just see what you're doing out there. And maybe they go to your About Us section in your website, but most likely because they want to work with you and not because they want to shop with you.
Another aspect that I think quite a lot of brands in general get wrong, but also young brands get wrong, is once they've reached people and got their attention, they leave it at that. They just got the attention, but they don't focus on creating some sort of hook or emotion and then going on to put that emotion on that or all of that into some mode of action, which is really stupid, because something I learned on social media is that if you don't tell people what to do, they literally won't do anything. So if you don't put a CTA somewhere, it's lost. What's your take on this?
I think that's totally right for performance-driven advertising. I think for brand building, it's not that relevant. It's enough if I get your attention and I get you to feel something, and I can leave it there, basically. I'm not a huge fan of brand campaigns who want me to do anything. That's a little bit, that's coming back to the consumer has better things to do. They don't really care about your event. They don't really care about whatever. They just need to be entertained when it comes to brand building.
So
and
the
then
whole salience thing.
It's a salience thing. We know that for instance, emotions are way better than rational arguments to convert people to your brand or making people aware of your brand. And it's therefore, I don't think for brand building, it's so important to get a call to action somewhere or to make people do something. It's more like, what kind of impression do I leave in the mind of the consumers?
I meant that in relation to advertising that's meant to sell, but the whole aspect of not just getting the attention and creating some sort of emotion in someone, that counts for both, right?
Totally. I think we know that performance-driven marketing works kind of better in some situations if I'm rational and I give you the right arguments, whatever that means.
50% off,
50%.
rational argument.
Maybe, or new technology or whatever.
Yeah.
but it's way easier to work with emotions. And if you have a look at really successful sales people, they get that intuitively. They start with emotions, mostly like fear of missing out, or don't you want to be a better person, and describe the better person you can buy into. And I think you need to have this kind of emotion in there as well. But yes, if in terms of performance, you need to have a call to action or some rational argument why you need to act now.
Yes. Another question that many startups approach me with as well is the whole thing of what channels should we be on? And quite often I observe that they try to be on all of the channels all at once, right from the start, and then they sort of lose their focus. Do you have any tips for a startup on what channels they should focus on first?
Yes, first off, don't assume that your media behavior is the same as your target audience. Get some data wherever you want to get it, be it best for planning, be it TGI in the international context, or even go to Statista, whatever you prefer as a source of truth, but try to get some idea what is the actual media behavior of your target audience. I think that's something which is fundamentally overlooked in all the discussions. And they always start with no one is watching TV or print anymore and so on. Yeah, not really true. Here you go. That's the first one. The second one is I would try to, depending on the size of your market, to go for just a few channels and try to build reach in there first. And once you reached all the people in this one channel, then you can move to another. Why is it important? Because it's not just that the advertisement appears magically on a different platform, but you need to have the attention, the budget, etc. on there as well. And so, for instance, if you go for Instagram and for TikTok, you suddenly have to work on both channels. Suddenly you have to double the creative investment because, as we all know, Instagram works a bit differently than TikTok, or hugely differently. And you need to have the double of the investment. And I wouldn't recommend that. I would start with one channel, preferably the channel where most of my consumers are already in. Most likely, it's not TikTok. But that's just my educated guess. In general, obviously, you have some consumers or target audiences which are way more reachable via TikTok than via other channels. But as I said, you need to have solid data on that. That's the first one. And then I would gradually move to other channels. And I would do that by selecting those channels where I reach more of my consumer audience again. So if I reach 30% of my consumer audience in TikTok, and that's the highest number, I would start with TikTok. If I then reach 20% on Instagram, then I would move on and add Instagram as well, and so on. So that's for me the logic. It's a pure numbers game for me. I don't have any preference. If someone would say, I reach all my consumers in daily press, I would go for daily press.
That sounds like a very good advice. Optimizing for one channel at first and getting all of the potential out of it before moving on to the next. But obviously, what you also need to work on is where you send them. So sorting out a website and optimizing the very best that you can out of that, or your web shop. If you send people directly to the web shop without any step in between, that's probably the very first channel you should optimize before you even think about spending any ad dollars. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. We know that physical availability is one of the most crucial things there is. And basically, physical availability, for all your listeners who don't know what it is, what it means is basically how widely distributed am I and how easy is it to buy. The word physical is a little bit misleading because then we automatically think about the real world. This includes also your web shop. And if your web shop is not really findable or usable, or if it's a mess with like buying something on this shop, then start with that. And after you fixed that, go then and bring more users on the site. I'm a huge fan of some people out there who are optimizing the web shop after psychological biases and heuristics, because it's the same with the logos you mentioned earlier. If I go just with the best practice and benchmark stuff, all the web shops will look the same. But there's a huge potential to optimize for psychology and get more out of the user who is on your shop. So we had one experiment. It's not a shop, but it's similar to that. We had one experiment with a restaurant a couple of years ago, where we optimized the menu for psychological heuristics. And to give you just one tiny example, we rearranged the pizzas so that you don't start with the margarita, which is at that time priced at 10 euros, and then you go to the salami and so on. But we started with a quite expensive pizza at first, and then we had other pizzas.
So you set an anchor.
We set an anchor. And what it did was basically this restaurant made 50% more sales just because we used a few tiny interventions like setting an anchor, having social proof on there, tiny things like leaving out the euro sign after the figures, and we just put it down there in small print. All prices are in euro. Why? Because people don't like to give away money. And if you say 12 euros or just 12, it feels totally different. It's totally counterintuitive, but still it works. And that's something which I would probably start with an online shop if I had an online shop.
Okay, so let's go over the whole thing we've talked in the podcast again in some sort of logical step-by-step thing. So first you want to optimize the place where people go and have that fully optimized so that when you put your first ads in, which are very sales focused, you get money. And with that money, you can start building a brand or start going more up the funnel, up the sales funnel, doing some sort of mix of maybe a sales ad, but on a more brand focused channel and putting in some more brand work. And over time, might be 2 years, might be 3 years, might be 5 years, you can start also putting in more money into brand building. Also, you start with very few channels and you optimize for reach, but obviously making sure that your reach isn't lost, so don't spread it too far by focusing on a very small market, because there's not too little money, there's just too large of a market. And once you've obviously exhausted a target audience, you then move on. Same as with the channels. Did I miss any step in that?
No, I don't think you missed something. But when I heard you talking, I think we need to talk about one thing.
Okay.
And that's something which is really different to this kind of classical heuristics and principles you read about in how brands grow. It's about differentiation. If I would follow Byron Sharp and Aaron Berg-Bass, I would just go down the route, be distinctive, don't care about if you're different to your competitors, and so on. However, there's evidence out there, notably from Kantar, for example, where they analyzed if that's true in all life stages of your brand. And what they found, and then I think that's one of the exceptions where you need to think really differently than the big brands, is that as a small brand, it's much more important to be different to your competitors than for big brands. A big brand can be basically everything for everyone. A small brand needs to be different than the competitors. And that's something which you need to get really early on, because otherwise you will have a really hard time to grow. And that's one of the few things which is kind of important for small brands to grow beyond a certain stage.
Awesome. Thank you for adding that. Is there any other topic or area that we haven't touched on that you would like to talk about?
I would love to talk about measurement, where I think especially small brands and startups in particular are kind of getting it right and getting it wrong at the same time. What I love about the attitude of startups and small brands is that they are totally focused of what effect do I have with my budget? And as you realize, I avoid return of investment. And I explain why in a few sentences. That's something which isn't that common, surprisingly, in big brands. Big brands have the budget. Yes, obviously they get sometimes the question, but what's the return on that, etc. But as they have so much money, it's not that important that I squeeze out the last cent of my investment and that my investment is rightly put. Small brands need to think about that. And that's the part where they totally get it right. Where they totally get it wrong is how they do it. So first off, let's start with the obvious. If you are a digital focused marketeer, you're looking at loads of different dashboards, and I guarantee you 99% of all these figures in there are just shit. They're shit because you get it from basically platforms who are biased because they have a self-interest. Google will lie to you, Facebook will lie to you, etc. pp. And you need to take that with caution, what you're getting. That's the quality part of that. But all those figures are also shit because you're looking at the wrong stuff. And I really can't get my head around that. I'll give you an example. Facebook and Nielsen, I think it was 2012 or something like that, made a study with, I think it was 1,000 brand campaigns or campaigns from brands. And they had a look at the correlation and the causation of what kind of metrics are really driving business impact. And that was the time when you still looked for likes and these kind of things. And what they found was likes. There's no such thing as a predicting power. If you get more likes, you get good business results. Shares, the same thing. Click-through rate, the same thing. Number of clicks, the same thing. And we're not talking about just like this fluffy brand stuff, like is there something like an impact on awareness, for example, but on real purchase. And it's so counterintuitive. I think they hit this study because otherwise, I'm still wondering why they're still reporting these kind of numbers because they make no sense. So why do I have to look at numbers from which they know that they don't impact my goal? That's one big mistake. And the other thing is the obsession with return of investment.
Oh yeah, I have my word to pick with that as well. Because if you invest zero, your ROI is infinite.
Exactly. That's something really curious because I sometimes think that people forget how the formula is actually about return on investment. And you're right. If you divide it by zero, then I have an infinite return on investment. The thing with return on investment is it steers you automatically into the wrong direction. It steers you to unbelievable short-term channels and measures, like for instance, search, where you have no chance at all to build your brand as well.
Which might not matter in the first year, right? First year, fine.
It might not matter, but still, let's take this example. If I would go just by ROI, I would go to probably search. And what it does is basically I will just get found by people who are in the market. So a tiny percentage of people who could buy your product will search for it.
Something like 5%, right? It's like 5% of people are in the market, and how many of them are actively looking? Even less, maybe. So.
Exactly. And it's even worse if you have a groundbreaking new product no one knows about. How could they search for you? It's just not possible. So that's one part of the problem with return on investment. The other is we sometimes forget that there are diminishing returns. So if I spend more, my return on investment will more or less automatically go down. But it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. When we do econometric models with our clients, we always say, okay, we now have the base numbers and we know the return on investment. Now we want to do two things. The first one is to optimize for effectiveness so that your return on investment in theory goes up. And once it goes up, so I cracked the formula how to effectively convert people from that channel to your website, for instance, or to your shop or into a physical store, whatever. Then I want the number to be 1.01. Why? Because then I invest more. Once I have this kind of cracked effectiveness formula, how do I need to talk to people so they take action? I can spend more and more and more and more. And in total, I will end up with a shitload of money and a really, really bad looking ROI. And I will still get more with this 1.01 return on investment than with the 9 ROI figure when I spend much more. And that's a process which is kind of interesting because CFOs totally get it. Marketeers avoid it. Why? Because they're fearful. They fear that someone is just looking at the ROI figure and then say, oh, it's not working what we're doing. And I understand that. But if you're talking to a CFO, they totally get it. If you say, okay, first we want to get better, increase the ROI. And once we did that, now we spend loads and loads and loads of money because we know that we get more money out of it. And that's a simple formula to make more money, basically.
Another aspect of that is probably also one that's always underestimated by marketers, and that is that there's a lag effect to everything you do in marketing. And what you do now affects sales maybe only in a year or two. And then measuring ROI happens on like a quarterly base or on a half year or on a year base, and you're not even at the point where that investment has already paid you back, and then you're wondering, you're maybe reducing that asset, you're reducing it although it's effective, but you're just looking at the wrong time scale. And that's one thing that really bugs me, and that's really, in my opinion, fucked up about the whole markets and about stock exchanges and all of that, because it heavily focuses on that quarterly aspect, and really, that thinking then translates down to small brands as well and really hinders their growth.
Yes, and to add on that, I think marketing has an image problem, funnily enough. So we need to build brand, basically. Yeah. And I think it has to do something with the word long term, because it implies, if you're not really thinking about it, that you invest now and in 5 years' time, magically your numbers explode. But that's not the case. The case is over a longer period of time, you get a steady amount of money back. Whereas when I do a price promotion in 2 weeks, I get the price, the sales coming in those 2 weeks, and after that it stops. So I think we need another word for long term, because what we know as people who are quite deep into these kind of principles and logics and studies, etc., is that you get a payback like a dividend, basically. If I take your example of the stock market and take this analogy, like a dividend, it pays back over time. It's not something which I do today and in 3 years, here's your money back in total plus interest. It's not the same mechanic. And therefore, it's quite hard to measure because I don't know if this kind of money is coming from my dividend, if we would like to call it like that. Is it coming from this short-term activation I'm just running? Or is it just baseline and it's coming anyways? No one knows because there's no label on the euro coming in. And that's basically a problem. And I think the only thing we can do is to explain it properly to CFOs, to CEOs, so they understand. And usually those people get the concept quite well. And sometimes I think marketeers are afraid to say, I can't put an exact number on that. but I can tell you how it works in theory, even if you don't say, okay, this is the exact number. They know that. It's the same discussion like, okay, should I open up a new factory? And they also know that probably the first cost estimate will not be the number they will pay because it's in the future and there will be problems, or there will be surprises and it will be cheaper. They don't care. If it's you just need to make an argument and a compelling business case, and you need to know what kind of mechanics are there. But it's explainable. It's not like a holy grail.
Okay, well, totally right. And I think that we have an education and an image problem with marketing. And I'm hopefully working on that by trying to spread the news about great ideas on this podcast. Now, there's a question I always ask people at the end, and that's, when's the last time you felt like a company really provided you value beyond what you expected? Is there anything that comes to mind?
Yes, it's quite easy. It's from a big player. It's from Mars and Snickers. They just released, I think, a couple of months ago, high protein versions of Mars and Snickers, and I'm totally in love with that because it's the first high protein bar which doesn't taste like shit. And yes, I know it's not the highest protein bar in the market, but it's a little bit less sugary than the original ones. It's a little bit healthier and it tastes awesome. And I can totally recommend that.
Awesome. Now it's the time for you to shine a little light on maybe what you do. What would you like people to know about you, and where would you like to send people if they want to know more about your ideas for how small brands grow?
Yeah, you can find me with Peter Kiefer on LinkedIn. It's like Kiefer Sutherland and Peter, so it's quite easy. There you can see all my posts about marketing effectiveness, etc., and you can drop me a message. And what I'm doing in real life, if I'm not writing something or sitting on a podcast, is basically helping all those kind of effectiveness principles to come to play for small brands, for big brands, preferably for smaller brands, because it's much more fun to see them play out because the effects are so huge.
And you do that where?
We are focused on Germany. Basically, we work with clients all across Germany. We are based in Hamburg. We also work in the UK and the US, but we are still based in Germany. So we would probably end up on a Zoom call or a Teams call. But yes, we are basically a small consultancy out of Hamburg.
Awesome. And what's your website called?
So the company is called Punch. You can find it under marketingpunch.de, and there you can see what we're doing and what we're offering and with what kind of clients we already work with.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Peter. I hope to see you soon in real life.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for having this conversation. It was really awesome. Loved it.
Cheers.
Cheers.